Okay, everybody. Thank y'all so much for coming. This is the second time that I've been here, my second event. I'm really excited to do it. I'm also a little bit nervous, so hopefully it'll go okay. Get this thing in the right place. Okay. Anyway. Okay, so my name is Elizabeth J. Smith, and I'm the author of the Tales of Harriford Grange series. This is the second book that I'm got today. First one is Tales Volume 1, without a subtitle. So if you don't have that one, I've got some for sale as well. Let's see, I think I covered that. So the Tales of Harriford Grange series is a series of short stories that are Christian historical romance. And they're inspired by Jane Austen and my love of the classics and historical fiction. And the second book, when I started writing the second book, I decided I wanted to write a mystery. And originally, when I wrote the first one, I gave myself a limit of 20 pages. But when I started writing a mystery, that very quickly became apparent that that was too short. That I couldn't get the mystery and the story that I wanted to write in 20 pages. So I ended up doing a 3-part mystery and then a 1-part romantic comedy at the end. So I'm going to be starting at the beginning of the mystery because I didn't want to jump part of the way into it and then, you don't want to start a mystery movie or mystery novel part of the way through. So I'm going to start at the beginning and I'm going to read the prologue and then a little bit into the current mystery. So the first mystery in this book is titled Verity, a Mystery in 3 Parts. And it's the story of a young woman with a mysterious past. It's a young lady who doesn't know where she came from. And it's actually inspired by, who in here has read Jane Austen's Emma? Has anybody or seen a video of it? Well, if you have, yeah, of course you have. I made you watch it. So, I don't think she's seen it though. So in Jane Austen's Emma, if you haven't read it or watched the video of it, it's a very, very good story. And in it, there's a rich young lady named Emma, who is a very meddlesome young lady. She was trying to get involved in everyone's love lives. But there's a young lady that she becomes friends with named Harriet Smith. She's an orphan who lives in a young ladies boarding school, and she doesn't know where she came from, and she never finds out in the story. Austen never goes into her background. You never find out where she came from. In reading that, I felt like it would be really neat to explore what it would be like for a young lady in that situation to discover where she came from. And so, of course, when you do that, you want it to be something interesting. You don't want just, she came from some rich people out somewhere who just didn't want her, that kind of thing. You just want something a little more interesting. My character in my book is her name is Adelaide Templeton, but her friends call her Adele. So sometimes when I'm reading, I'll say Adelaide, and sometimes I'll say Adele, and it's the same person. So in the prologue, she arrives alone and unescorted to the school. She's about 3 years old. So that's what you're going to see at the beginning. And then I'll be setting up a confrontation of sorts between the Constable Craig McKinnon, who is her nemesis, and Adelaide. And they have a rocky background. This is the first of the stories I've written where the background between the characters is years and years of conflict. Like all the others, they've kind of met, or if they've known each other, it's not been this kind of relationship. So that was very different for me. I hadn't written that before. And I'm not going to actually read to the point that the conflict, so if you haven't read it yet, you'll have to read further than I'm going to read. So I wanted to explore the dynamics of two people who have this long-standing conflict, who end up having to get together to solve a problem and then overcome their differences, because I think that's really important for all of us to try to overcome the differences that we have with people in our life. And I will certainly do as well. So, all right, I'm going to get started and get the reading, because I know you don't want to listen to me for too awful long talking. All right, so Verity, a Mystery in 3 parts. Part 1, Once Left, prologue. A knock at the door drew the attention of Mrs. Long, the widowed headmistress of the Harriford Grange School for Young Ladies. She shook her head in consternation. Who would be calling right before supper? She'd finally managed to get all of her young ladies settled, which was no small feat. Rising from her seat at the head of the table, she shot looks of warning to the pupils. I'll be back in a moment. A polite yes, ma'am, followed her into the foyer. She opened the door and looked down into the fulminant eyes of a little girl. She was small, perhaps only 3 years old. Her natural cocoa skin and lush coffee curls stood out sharply against her lacy cream-colored dress. Pinned to her bodice were 2 envelopes, one sealed with scarlet wax. Being a naturally affectionate person, Mrs. Long squatted down and held her arms out to the girl. Come here, my child. Are you hungry? We're about to eat supper. The child hesitated only a moment before flinging herself into the lady's arms. She clung tightly to her, and Mrs. Long thought the girl might begin to cry. However, she did not, and was soon seated between 2 other little girls with a big bowl of stew and a thick slice of homemade sourdough bread. Mrs. Long watched her all through supper, pondering how she had come to be in her care. It was rare, but not unheard of, for a girl to arrive unescorted to the school. In most cases, this meant the guardian wished to remain anonymous. While to many schools this would be seen as a burden, Mrs. Long was fortunate enough to receive the patronage of the wealthy families of Harriford Grange, the Musgraves being the principal donors. It allowed her to take in cases such as this one. She'd removed the 2 envelopes from the girl's dress and was anxious to see the contents. Once the pupils were settled in their after-supper activities, she would excuse herself to her study. She'd shown the girl, who called herself Adele, a bed and trunk before leaving her in the care of one of the older girls who would bathe her. Closing her office door, Mrs. Long sat at her desk and examined the 2 envelopes. One was addressed to her, and the other was for a Miss Adelaide Templeton to be opened on her 21st birthday. She set that one aside and ripped open the first one. Dear Madam, I find myself unable to care for this child. My health is in rapid decline, and the doctor says I am not long for this world. I heard of your kindness through one of my friends, and I hope you will take in little Adelaide. She is a very dear girl, although an orphan. Her father and mother have preceded me in death. I have set up an account through my solicitor to see that you are paid regularly until she reaches her 21st birthday. I hope by then she may be settled with a husband, or perhaps as a governess. Give her my love, and tell her I miss her terribly. Kindest regards, Mrs. Long scrutinized the signature, but could not make it out. It was scribbled by a person different from the letter writer, which would mean she had employed a scribe. She sighed and held up the enclosed check, noting it had been sent from a solicitor's office. It was more than enough to see the girl through, and she knew better than to inquire for the identity of the benefactor. As with her other girls, she would set aside the extra money to be used to enhance Adelaide's experience at her school. Being a Christian, she had no inclination to keep the money for herself. In the process of time, Mrs. Long remarried and gave the school over to a Mrs. Jefferson, who was a good sort of woman. During the transfer, a few of the pupils' files got mixed in with Mrs. Long, now McKinnon's, personal things. They lay forgotten in the attic of the McKinnon home, Mrs. Jefferson never having missed them. Meanwhile, Adelaide grew up, becoming well versed in reading, writing, and arithmetic, as well as the fine arts and household chores. She was a naturally happy sort of girl, well liked by all her sisters, as they called each other. It was only late at night, while her sisters were asleep, that Adelaide wondered about herself. Who was she, and where did she come from? Did she have any family? Why didn't they want her? 19 years later. Constable Craig McKinnon stared at the envelope as if it were on fire. He'd been cleaning out the attic for his father and stumbled across a box of his stepmother's things. Curious, he'd looked through them and found a file with Miss Templeton's name on it. Inside, among routine paperwork, he found 2 envelopes. One was open and the other was sealed. He read the open letter against his better judgment and was now very curious about the contents of the second envelope. To Miss Adelaide Templeton, to be opened on her 21st birthday. He knew Miss Templeton and would take the envelope to her. He frowned. It wouldn't be a pleasant meeting. If there was one person in this whole world she didn't like, it was him. And she had a very good reason. No, it would not be a pleasant meeting at all. Well, Mary, where did you see it last? Adelaide asked her friend, putting her hands on her slim hips. Mary was a sweet girl, but she was prone to be absent-minded. The rolling pin was nowhere in sight. I don't remember, Adele. I'm so sorry. Adelaide pushed an unruly coffee-colored curl from her forehead and went in search of an alternative. She found an old glass bottle, washed it, and used it to roll up the pie crust. She knew how to make do with what she had. Adelaide, called Mrs. Jefferson, you have a caller. She washed her hands and hurried to the parlor, hoping it was one of her friends from the Church of Christ at Harriford Grange. She stopped short at the sight of a familiar, sandy-haired man in a black uniform. Good afternoon, Miss Templeton, he said grimly. Constable McKinnon, to what do I owe this pleasure? She asked in sarcasm. Of all the nerve! She would have him kicked out of the house if she had any clout. He held out a folder. I found this in my stepmother's things. I believe it belongs to you. She grabbed it from him and examined its contents. Her admittance paperwork. Shouldn't Mrs. Jefferson have that? In 2 envelopes. You opened it, she scolded, referencing the top one. I did not, he replied, although his red complexion told her he'd found it open and read the letter. She ignored him for a moment as she pondered the second envelope and its scarlet seal. An imprint of a woodpecker was set into the wax. What an odd choice, she thought. On the front she read her name and inhaled sharply. 21st birthday! But she was already 22. She cut the constable a sideways glance as he read her thoughts. I found them yesterday evening. So, he hadn't kept them on purpose. She pulled the letter out of the open envelope, too curious to wait until she was alone. As she read, a tear rolled down her cheek. She had had a family, after all, and they were gone. A steadying hand touched her elbow. Are you all right? Craig asked. She shook her head as he guided her to a chair. I'll call for a glass of water. That's quite unnecessary, she whispered. I'll be fine in a moment. She tapped her knee with the sealed envelope. Would you like me to leave? He asked, taking a step toward the door. No, I don't want to be, she almost said alone, but she was. Of course she had her sisters, Mrs. Jefferson, and her friends from church, but what she longed for was a family, a real family. I can fetch one of the other girls, or Mrs. Jefferson. Craig, please, don't stand on ceremony. We know each other too well for that. He lowered himself onto the settee and clasped his hands tightly in front of him. He looked contrite. Well, you should be. Without further ado, she slid her light brown finger under the seal and peered into the envelope. She pulled out a miniature of a woman. She had skin the color of a bay mare and eyes and hair like ebony. She was dressed in the fashions of 20 or so years prior. On the back was the word Verity. She looks like you, Craig said, reminding her he was in the room. Who is it? She asked, to which he had no answer. She opened the envelope again, but it was empty. She scanned the letter again. Can you make out the signature? He took the letter over to the window to catch the bright morning light. The name might start with a W, but other than that, I'm not sure. She joined him at the window, taking the letter from his outstretched hand. At least, she thought, she had once been loved. Okay, so I started smiling because my daughter was back there looking at me watching me. So, all right, thank you guys so much for listening. If you want to find out what on earth this woodpecker and the letter and everything else is about, you'll have to read the book. If you want to find out what happens between, if you want to find out what happens between Craig and Adelaide, if they can resolve their differences and why they have this conflict to begin with, you'll have to read it. And so, let's see. Just wrap this up real fast. I've got books available here. They're $6 a piece, and be happy to sign them for you if you want a personal message or just a signature. Just let me know. And if you have a message you want me to write or someone's name in a book, please write it down for me so I spell it correctly. And I can do cash, check, card, or Venmo. Yep, cash is good. That's my sister. So thank you guys so much. Does anybody have any questions?
How will I know who this W is? There's only so many women's names with W. I'm really thinking about it.
You'll have to read.
It's good, it's good. It's very good. Yeah. And the villain in it will get you too.
I like mystery.
Ooh.
No spoilers.
Okay.
I'll stop.
If you have any questions and you just want to ask me anytime about the book or self-publishing or anything like that, I'm happy to answer any of your questions. So thank you guys so much for coming, and we'll get started on the part.